Hello, I'm Lucy Jennings from the Creativity Patch. Come along with me and let's do some happy weaving. I'm going to be weaving this project on this frame loom, which I bought quite a few years ago, and I was happy to find out they still make them. It's called Cactus Flower Looms, and I'll have a link for it in the resource section. I'm going to be weaving this project just using the whole width of the loom because I want it to just fit on my stick here. And the width will be just right for this stick. So you'll have to be weaving yours for how wide you want yours to be to match whatever stick or hanging that you're going to be using. So that's when the measuring comes in. The first thing you want to do is find the center of your loom, and that's where we're going to be using the ruler. This loom is 12 inches wide, so the center of it is 6 inches. What you want to do is measure half that length on each side of the center. So what you're basically doing is just centering your project. Let's say, for example, your weaving project is going to be 6 inches wide. What you would do is measure 1, 2, 3 inches on one side and 1, 2, 3 inches to the other side. And that will be how you'll center your project. Now, my project is just going to be simply the whole width, so that's going to be easy. Also, you want to think about how many threads per inch you want. This loom has 10 notches per inch, so I just decided to skip every other notch and make my threading be 5 threads per inch. 4 or 5 threads per inch is just fine. So figure out what you need to do for the loom you're using, and then let's get started warping. Well, it's time to warp the loom. And before we get started, let's think about how many warp threads we'll need. My weaving is going to be 8 inches wide, and I've chosen to use 5 threads per inch. So that means I'm going to need 5 times 8 warp threads, and that would be 40. Sometimes with the frame loom, people wind their warp from the top to the bottom, just like that. We're not going to be doing that this time. We're going to be winding all the way around the loom. I'm doing that because I want to have the extra warp so that at the end we can tie it onto the branch easily. So I'm going to take the warp thread, I'm going to tie it to the bottom of the loom. And this is just holding it in place to keep it tight. If you happen to be using the book loom instead, you would just tie it to the back of the book. Now, as I pull out the warp thread out of the ball, it's going to start going all over the table. So I'm going to put it down on the ground to keep it out of the way. And I'll just start by going through the first notch and skipping a notch each time. And you'll do yours however works best for the loom you're using. Just keep that tension as tight as possible. That's the most important thing, is a tight, even tension. Now, some threads are more forgiving than others. For example, if you're using cotton as the warp, it's a little more forgiving with if you don't quite get the tension exactly perfect. But linen and hemp, they aren't forgiving. They don't kind of like spring back. What you wind it with is what you get. So I want to get it as tight as possible. Now, one thing I like about a frame loom is that, like, what if all of a sudden something happens and you've got to leave while you're warping? It's always best to warp all at the same time. But what if something happens? Well, what you can do is just take your warp thread and you can just wrap it around some part of the loom. quite a few times. And then you're good to go. Then when you return, you would just put your finger on that warp thread and continue winding. Now before I'm completely finished, I'm going to double check that I've got it all evenly spaced. So while I do that, I'm going to wind my warp thread a few times. This time I'm just going to put it around the corner here. That way it's nice and secure while I double check. I'm going to get a piece of paper here and I'm putting it inside the space between the top of the warp and the bottom down here. Now what I'm going to do to finish off my warping is, as you remember, I wound it around a bunch of times around the corner here. I'm going to snip it off now. And I'm going to take another length of warp thread, about 12 inches, and I am going to tie this warp thread to the bottom of the loom. So I'm going to tie it around the bottom beam, leaving one length of it longer than the other. You'll see why. Before I actually tie it off, I want to make sure that I have an even number of threads, because I'm going to be tying this to the top of the stick, and I'll be using 2 threads for each tie. So I'll count them out. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 36, and 37. So I want it to be 38. So what I'm going to do is take this end here, which I have quite a bit of length of, and I am going to take it around and wind it up. So I have one more thread there. That makes it 38. Now I'm going to turn the loom over. And the reason why we tied this thread onto the bottom beam is it makes it really easy to just tie this warp thread to that thread on the bottom beam. Nice and tight as possible. Now we'll trim it off a little bit. Trim this one a little bit. And we're ready to weave. If you'd like to learn more about weaving, subscribe to my channel. And be sure to check out my website, The Creativity Patch. There's lots more things to learn there, and I've got some really fun weaving kits. See you there, and happy weaving!